There are moments in life when fear whispers louder than faith, when the weight of what might go wrong presses harder on our hearts than the promise of what God has already made possible. We know the feeling standing on the edge of purpose, sensing destiny calling our name, yet something unseen pulls us back. It's not weakness, it's not failure, it's the quiet, crippling curse of fear. Fear has a way of dressing itself in logic, appearing like protection, pretending it is keeping us safe. But in reality, it is the invisible chain that keeps us bound to smaller versions of ourselves. It makes us doubt the gifts God placed within us. It convinces us that the giants ahead are bigger than the God behind us. It limits our prayers, shrinks our vision, and blinds us to opportunities that were heaven sent. But today, something is about to shift. Today, we confront the force that has hidden in the shadows of our minds, robbing us of joy, courage, and divine momentum. Today, we pull back the veil and expose fear for what it truly is, a spiritual thief with no real power except the power we surrender to it. Because when faith rises, fear dissolves. When truth is spoken, bondage breaks. And when God steps in, everything that once intimidated us must bow. This moment is more than motivation. It is an awakening, an invitation to step into the boldness that heaven has always intended for you. The path ahead may be unfamiliar. The calling may be bigger than your experience, and the future may feel uncertain. But you were not designed to live small, silent, or afraid. You were crafted by the Creator of the universe, breathed into with purpose, and anointed to overcome every barrier seen and unseen. So as we begin this journey together, prepare your heart. Something powerful is about to be stirred inside you. The fear that once held you back is about to lose its grip, and the faith within you is about to rise stronger than ever before. Fear loses its power the moment you confront it with faith, because fear thrives in darkness, uncertainty, and silence. It grows strongest when it remains unchallenged, when the heart accepts its whispers as truth, and when the mind rehearses its lies more than God's promises. Fear feeds on hesitation. It feeds on the moments when you question your worth, your calling, or your ability to walk into the next level. But the instant you decide to face that fear, whether it's the fear of failure, rejection, loss, inadequacy, or the unknown, something supernatural begins to shift within you. The atmosphere around you changes because faith, even in its smallest measure, carries divine authority. Faith does not need the entire path to be visible. It only needs the courage to take one step. And in taking that step, you weaken the grip of fear, because fear cannot survive where faith is active, moving, and engaged. When you confront fear with faith, you call it out from the shadows and drag it into the light of truth. Fear is loud only when unopposed, but faith has a voice that carries heaven's resonance. Faith reminds you that you are not walking alone, that God has already gone before you, and that every barrier fear magnifies is already under divine control. You begin to realize that fear is not a spiritual authority, but a spiritual distortion, an exaggerated picture of what could go wrong, created to blind you from what God intends to make right. Faith reframes your vision. It helps you see beyond the immediate discomfort and into the bigger purpose being formed. It reminds you that God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind, meaning fear is not a part of your divine identity, and confronting it is not only possible, but required for your growth. As faith rises, something inside you awakens. You begin to feel the alignment between your spirit and the promises spoken over your life. Fear tries to whisper that the challenge ahead is too big, but faith responds with the assurance that God has equipped you for every battle. Fear says you're unprepared. Faith says you're chosen. Fear says the risk is too great. Faith says the reward is greater. Fear says you don't have what it takes. Faith says that what God placed inside you is more than enough. And when that inner dialogue begins to shift, your confidence shifts with it. You no longer look at the obstacle as something designed to stop you, but as something designed to strengthen you. You begin to understand that confronting fear is not a moment of weakness. It is a moment of spiritual authority, a reclaiming of your identity, and a declaration that you refuse to be imprisoned by what God has already empowered you to overcome. Each time you face fear with faith, you dismantle its foundation, you break its patterns, you interrupt its influence. Fear becomes smaller because you are no longer giving it permission to dominate your thoughts or dictate your decisions. You begin to look at situations not through the lens of what could go wrong, but through the lens of what God can do. This shift transforms your entire approach to life. Instead of avoiding challenges, you lean into them with courage. Instead of retreating when things feel uncomfortable, you step forward with expectation. Instead of internalizing doubt, you internalize God's truth. And that truth becomes your weapon, your anchor, and your source of strength. Faith does not guarantee that fear disappears instantly. Instead, it ensures that fear no longer controls you. Every step of faith is a step toward freedom. Every act of courage is a spiritual breaking of chains. Every moment you choose faith over fear, you reinforce heaven's authority over your life. You begin to realize that fear was never a sign that you were incapable. It was a sign of the magnitude of the assignment on your life. Fear fights hardest where your purpose is greatest. It resists where breakthrough is near. It pushes back where destiny is close. But faith pushes harder because faith is backed by the power of God, not by the instability of emotion. Confronting fear with faith also exposes the illusions. Fear builds. Fear creates mental prisons, but faith unlocks them. Fear creates imaginary outcomes, worst-case scenarios that feel real because they activate emotional responses. But faith challenges those narratives, asking, what if the opposite happens? What if the outcome is better than expected? What if this step leads to favor, expansion, blessing, or transformation? Faith shifts your mindset from reaction to revelation. It reminds you that God's plans for you are not rooted in fear, but in hope, purpose, and divine intention. And as you continue confronting fear, you start to notice that the things that once intimidated you no longer carry the same weight. You become spiritually conditioned to operate in courage. You become bold, not because you have all the answers, but because you trust the one who does. You begin to take risks you once avoided. You pursue opportunities you once dismissed. You speak truths you once silenced. You move with a confidence that is not worldly but heavenly. Your spirit understands that fear is a distortion, but faith is a revelation. Fear is a chain, but faith is the key. Fear is an obstacle, but faith is the path through it. This transformation doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens with every decision to choose faith even when fear is present. It happens in the quiet places of the heart where you refuse to agree with the lies fear tries to whisper. It happens when you remind yourself of what God has already brought you through, of the battles you've survived, the storms you've endured, the moments you thought would break you but instead made you stronger. Faith grows in remembrance, and fear weakens in the presence of gratitude. Every testimony of where God has shown up becomes evidence that fear's predictions were false. Every memory of deliverance becomes a weapon against the next attack. The truth is, fear is not an indication that God is absent. Many times, fear appears strongest right before a breakthrough, right before a promotion, right before a shift, right before something new is about to be birthed in your life. Fear senses the potential of what you're about to step into. It senses the threat you become when fully aligned with God's purpose. That is why confronting fear is not only an act of courage, but an act of spiritual warfare. It is a declaration that you recognize the enemy's strategy and choose not to bow to it. You choose to stand, to speak, to move, to believe, because your faith is not rooted in your strength, but in God's. The moment you confront fear with faith, heaven begins to respond. Strength rises, peace follows, boldness develops. God fills the space that fear once occupied. And slowly you realize that the chains were never as strong as they felt. The walls were never as high as they appeared. The limitations were never as fixed as you imagined. You were stronger than you thought. You were braver than you believed. You were more capable than fear ever wanted you to know. You were always equipped, always called, always supported by divine power. Faith does not ignore the presence of fear. It simply refuses to bow to it. Faith does not eliminate uncertainty. It empowers you to move forward despite it. Faith does not guarantee an easy path. It guarantees a victorious outcome. And in every step of that journey, fear loses more of its influence, more of its volume, more of its control. It becomes background noise rather than a defining force. It becomes a reminder of how far you're rising, not a threat to your progress. Fear loses its power the moment you confront it with faith, because faith activates the God within you. Faith opens the door for divine strength. Faith calls heaven into your situation. Faith aligns your spirit with divine truth. And once truth enters, fear has no place left to hide. Your identity and purpose are stronger than the limitations fear creates, because who you are in God carries more weight than anything that tries to hold you back. Fear builds barriers, but identity breaks them. Fear whispers limitations, but purpose shouts divine intention. When you truly understand who you are, crafted by God's hands, filled with His breath, designed with intention, you begin to recognize that fear is not a reflection of your ability, but a reflection of the enemy's desperation to stop you from realizing your potential. Purpose is powerful. Purpose is prophetic. Purpose is heaven's assignment wrapped in human form. And fear knows that once you embrace your identity, you become unstoppable. You become a threat to every chain that once tried to bind you. The enemy does not attack what is insignificant. He attacks what is impactful. He attacks identity, because identity influences destiny. If he can get you to believe that you are unworthy, incapable, or unqualified, he can convince you to walk away from what God has already prepared for you. But the truth is that your identity was established long before fear ever tried to shape your narrative. God spoke purpose into you before you took your first breath. He wired you with gifts, strengths, and spiritual capacities that fear cannot erase. Fear can only distort when identity is unclear. But when you know who you are, fear's power dissolves. It loses the ability to define your boundaries or dictate your future. There is a divine strength that rises when you embrace the truth of your identity. You stop shrinking to fit expectations that were never yours. You stop apologizing for the calling on your life. You stop dimming your light to keep others comfortable. You stop believing the lies fear uses to convince you that your purpose is too big for you to handle. Instead, you begin to walk in the authority God intended for you. You begin to see yourself not through the lens of your past mistakes or insecurities, but through the lens of God's design. And that shift transforms everything, the way you think, the way you speak, the way you approach your future. Your purpose is not fragile. It is not dependent on circumstances being perfect. It is not canceled by setbacks or detours. Purpose is resilient because it comes from God. Even when life tries to break you, purpose keeps calling you forward. Even when fear tries to intimidate you, Purpose keeps reminding you that you were created for more. Purpose is the internal compass that keeps pulling you toward destiny. You may ignore it, suppress it, or delay it, but it will not disappear. It is the divine imprint within you, the unmistakable pull that tells you there is something greater waiting beyond your comfort zone. Fear often magnifies your weaknesses, but identity magnifies your origin. When you know that you come from God, created in His image, fear's attempt to reduce you to your insecurities becomes powerless. You begin to realize that your life is not random, your gifts are not accidental, and your dreams are not illusions. They are evidence of God's intention. Fear may try to convince you that your purpose is unreachable, but identity reminds you that God equips those He calls. Fear says the journey is too long. Identity says the journey was designed for you. Fear says you don't have what it takes. Identity says God placed everything you need within you. When you embrace your identity, you step into a level of clarity that fear cannot withstand. You begin to recognize the difference between your limitations and fear's illusions. Many of the barriers you face are not actual obstacles, but spiritual mirages created to distract you from pursuing your God-given path. But once identity becomes your foundation, you no longer accept fear's narratives as truth. You stop questioning your worth and start embracing your calling. You stop doubting your abilities and start trusting God's preparation. You stop retreating and start rising. Purpose gives you spiritual stamina. It gives you the courage to move through seasons that don't make sense. It helps you endure storms, resist temptations, and rise after setbacks. It becomes the fuel that pushes you forward even when fear tries to convince you that you're stuck. And every time you choose purpose over fear, you reinforce your spiritual identity. You remind yourself that you are not defined by your past, not limited by your environment, not confined by people's opinions. You are defined by God, and what God defines cannot be diminished by fear. Identity also reveals your authority. You are not merely a person trying to navigate life. You are a vessel chosen by God, empowered by His Spirit. There is a holy assignment on your life that fear cannot erase. When you walk in identity, you walk in power. You speak differently. You pray differently. You make decisions differently. You elevate your thinking to match the level of your calling. You align your actions with God's vision for you. And fear begins to lose its grip because it cannot coexist with someone who knows who they are. Purpose strengthens your spirit with divine confidence, not arrogance, but assurance, an unshakable knowing that your life is meaningful, intentional, and heaven-backed. You begin to understand that your presence on this earth has significance, that your voice matters, that your gifts carry impact, that your journey is part of a greater plan. And with every new revelation of identity, fear shrinks, fear becomes small, fear becomes hollow. Fear becomes nothing more than background noise trying to distract you from a destiny too powerful to be stopped. Even when fear tries to resurface, because it will, you now face it with a different posture. You are no longer the person who accepted fear's lies as truth. You are no longer the person who allowed limitations to control your decisions. You are no longer the person who saw yourself as incapable. Now, you see fear for what it truly is, a reaction to your rising purpose, a desperate attempt to pull you backward, a sign that you are stepping into something significant. And this awareness gives you spiritual leverage. You confront fear not from a place of insecurity, but from a place of identity. You confront it knowing that you have divine backing. You confront it understanding that purpose outweighs every challenge ahead. Knowing your identity also creates spiritual alignment. You begin to discern opportunities meant for you and release the ones that are not. You stop wasting emotional energy on things that don't contribute to your assignment. You begin to walk with intentionality, choosing environments, relationships, and habits that nurture your calling. Fear thrives in confusion, but identity brings clarity. Fear thrives in doubt, but identity brings conviction. Fear thrives in hesitation, but purpose brings acceleration. Purpose activates perseverance. It empowers you to endure when others quit. It gives you strength when circumstances feel overwhelming. It keeps you grounded when fear tries to shake your foundation. It reminds you that every challenge carries meaning and every season prepares you for the next. You begin to interpret hardships not as signs that you are unqualified, but as training for what you are becoming. Your perspective shifts from why is this happening to what is this preparing me for? And that shift alone weakens fear's power over you. There is also a spiritual boldness that emerges when you embrace identity. You stop asking permission to be who God called you to be. You stop shrinking around people who cannot handle your growth. You stop sabotaging your own progress out of fear that you aren't enough. Instead, you rise, you expand, you step into rooms you once felt unworthy to enter. You apply for opportunities you once assumed were out of reach. You speak with authority. You walk with intention. You carry yourself as someone who understands that heaven has invested greatness within you. Purpose reveals your resilience. It shows you that what you thought would break you actually strengthened you, that the pain you endured produced wisdom, that the struggles you faced built endurance, that the battles you fought sharpened your spirit. You begin to see that every difficulty you survived has positioned you for influence, impact, and spiritual maturity. And as you acknowledge this, fear loses its argument. It can no longer convince you that you are fragile, because your history proves your strength. Your identity and purpose are stronger than the limitations fear creates, because fear operates from deception, but identity operates from truth. Fear operates from doubt, but purpose operates from divine intention. Fear operates from scarcity, but identity operates from spiritual abundance. And when you choose to live according to who God says you are, fear becomes too small to stop you, too weak to control you, and too inconsistent to define you. Stepping forward despite fear activates divine momentum in your life, because movement itself is a declaration of faith. Fear tries to freeze you, to keep you stuck in the familiar, to convince you that standing still is safer than stepping into the unknown. But the moment you choose to move, no matter how small that movement is, you break fear's pattern. You interrupt its strategy. You announce to the atmosphere that you refuse to be governed by what intimidates you. This act of stepping forward becomes a spiritual catalyst. It signals to heaven that you are ready, available, and willing, and heaven responds to movement. God does not require you to have everything figured out. He simply asks you to step, and when you step, something shifts around you and within you. Fear often grows loudest right before a breakthrough, because that is the moment when momentum is most easily interrupted. Momentum is fragile at the beginning. The enemy knows that if he can stop you at the starting line, he won't have to stop you later. He targets your first steps because those steps carry prophetic power. The initial decision to move forward, even while afraid, is what breaks stagnation. It disrupts cycles of doubt, hesitation, and overthinking. It dismantles the illusion of safety that fear constructs. And once you take that first step, you've already defeated the version of yourself that fear tried to hold hostage. Divine momentum is not just physical movement. It is spiritual acceleration. It is the force that carries you farther than your own strength could. It is what happens when your action aligns with God's intention. You may feel unprepared, uncertain, or overwhelmed, but movement creates space for revelation. Movement opens doors that standing still could never reveal. Many of the blessings waiting for you are not visible from the place of fear. They become visible only when you begin to walk. Purpose often unfolds while you are moving. Clarity often comes after obedience. And confidence grows with every step taken in faith. When you step forward despite fear, you demonstrate that your trust in God outweighs your trust in comfort. Fear wants you to believe that comfort equals safety, but comfort often equals stagnation. Purpose is rarely born in comfortable spaces. Growth rarely happens where everything feels predictable. When you move beyond what is familiar, you step into an environment where God can stretch you, shape you, and strengthen you. This is why your movement matters, because it positions you to receive what fear tries to hide from you. Every time you push past fear and step forward, you gain spiritual ground. You begin to reclaim territory that fear once claimed in your mind. The places where you once avoided action become places where you now exercise authority. You start building a pattern of courage, small decisions that accumulate into strength, small moments of boldness that become a lifestyle of faith. This is how momentum forms, not from one dramatic moment, but from consistent steps, each one weakening fear's influence. Fear tries to magnify the possible outcomes of failure, but faith magnifies God's ability to sustain you. When you move despite fear, you are not moving recklessly. You are moving with divine backing. God does not call you to a place He has not prepared. He does not ask you to step into territory where His grace cannot cover you. Your movement is not random, it is guided. It is intentional. It is part of a divine strategy that fear wants to distract you from. But once you take that step, you align yourself with a flow greater than your emotions. Divine momentum begins to carry you, making the next step easier, then the next, and the next. There will always be reasons to hesitate. Fear will always present what-ifs, worst-case scenarios, and imagined disasters. But movement requires shifting your focus from fear's predictions to God's promises. You begin to realize that most of what you feared was never real. It was inflated by uncertainty, magnified by hesitation, and strengthened by inactivity. But the moment you move, fear's shadow shrinks. You see that the barrier was not as strong as it appeared. You see that the challenge was not as impossible as it felt. You see that your obedience carried more power than you expected. Stepping forward despite fear also trains your spirit to depend on God, not circumstances. You learn that you don't need perfect timing, perfect conditions, or perfect clarity to move. You learn that faith does not eliminate uncertainty. It simply chooses not to bow to it. You learn that courage does not mean the absence of fear. It means deciding that fear will not dictate your choices. And this internal transformation strengthens your spiritual resilience. You begin to trust God beyond your feelings, beyond your doubts, beyond your understanding. Divine momentum also attracts opportunities. When you move, doors open that were previously locked. People appear who you were meant to meet. Resources shift in your direction. Delays break. Stagnation lifts. Favor increases. Not because movement manipulates God, but because movement aligns you with what He already ordained. Many doors remain closed, not because they are denied, but because they require movement to unlock. Faith is the key that turns the handle. But faith is active. It requires steps, not just thoughts. Momentum builds its own confidence. You start to notice that each step you take expands your capacity. You endure more than you thought you could. You create what you once felt unqualified to produce. You speak in places you once felt too intimidated to stand in. You take actions that once felt impossible. This growth reinforces your belief in God's ability to carry you. The more you move, the more you trust. The more you trust, the further you go, and fear loses more territory each time. Fear is designed to make you underestimate yourself and overestimate your obstacles. But movement reveals the truth. It shows you that you are capable of far more than your fears suggest. It shows you that what you thought was a wall was only a veil. It shows you that what you thought was a dead end was actually a doorway. Movement shifts perspective. You stop seeing from the viewpoint of limitation and begin seeing from the viewpoint of possibility. God often reserves revelation for those who move. Abraham did not see the ram until he walked up the mountain. Peter did not walk on water until he stepped out of the boat. The Israelites did not see the Red Sea part until they approached it. Movement activates miracles. It is the partnership between human faith and divine power. When you step, heaven responds. When you act, God accelerates. When you move, breakthroughs begin. At times, you may not feel ready, but readiness is not a requirement for divine momentum. God develops you along the way. He strengthens you as you step. He prepares you as you move. Some of the lessons you need cannot be learned from a distance. They require engagement. They require experience. They require courage in motion. And once you begin to experience God's faithfulness in those moments, fear loses the credibility it once held over your life. There is also a spiritual authority that rises when you step forward despite fear. You stop negotiating with your doubts. You stop giving fear the final word. You stop allowing intimidation to shape your decisions. You step into alignment with heaven's view of you, a view fear cannot access or influence. You begin to operate with a sense of purpose that is stronger than your emotions. You move because you were made to move, not because you feel fearless. And that posture itself activates greater strength, greater clarity, and greater momentum. Momentum also creates influence. Your courage becomes a testimony that others see. Your movement becomes encouragement for those who are stuck in their own battles with fear. Without even trying, your obedience inspires. Your willingness to move becomes a light for others still wrestling with hesitation. This influence is not forced. It is a natural result of living in alignment with your calling. People are drawn to movement, especially spiritual movement. They recognize the shift in your life and feel compelled to seek their own. Stepping forward despite fear teaches you to trust the process, not the feelings. Fear may continue to whisper, but it no longer governs you. You learn how to walk with fear, present but powerless. You learn how to keep moving even when your knees are shaking. You learn how to remain steady even when uncertainty surrounds you. This is maturity faith that functions despite discomfort. Faith that moves despite questions. Faith that progresses despite pressure. As momentum grows, you begin to recognize that every step you take is part of a bigger picture. Nothing is wasted. Every act of courage builds the foundation of the life God is calling you into. Every risk taken in obedience shapes your character, expands your capacity, and strengthens your spirit. You become someone who no longer lives according to fear's limitations, but according to God's possibilities. And the more you step, the more you discover that fear never had the authority to stop you. It only had the power you once surrendered to it. Divine momentum is transformative. It carries you into seasons you once prayed for, but were too afraid to pursue. It moves you through transitions that once felt impossible. It elevates your life beyond what you thought was reachable. It pushes you into purpose, influence, and spiritual maturity. And it all begins with one decision: to move forward, even when fear is present. When you choose that posture, heaven moves with you. Momentum surrounds you. Possibility opens before you. And you step into the life fear hoped you would never discover. And now, as you stand at the edge of your next breakthrough, let this truth settle deeply into your spirit. God does not require you to be fearless. He requires you to be willing. One step can change everything. One act of courage can unlock the blessings heaven has been holding for the moment you dared to move. So lift your foot, steady your heart, and take the step to fear never wanted you to take. Because the momentum that follows will carry you into a future overflowing with purpose, power, and divine possibility.